Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to talk about Project Deep Quest, which was an underwater psychic archaeological project with important theoretical consequences. And with me in the studio is Stephan Schwartz, who is the director of that project. He is one of the founders of the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness, part of the American Anthropological Association, a founder of the International Remote Viewing Association, and author of many books, including The Secret Vaults of Time, the Alexandria Project, Opening to the Infinite, and the 8 Laws of Change. Welcome, Stephan.
My pleasure.
Now, as I recall, the Project Deep Quest was really your first major archaeological investigation, wasn't it?
Yes. I came out of I had spent a number of years studying the Edgar Cayce material and the parapsychological literature.
And you had a background in the Navy as well.
No, I didn't have any background at all with the Navy. In 1970, however, the Navy asked me, or the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations asked me to become his special assistant. So, no, I had been the editor of Sea Power magazine.
Okay.
And the Admiral Zumwalt, Elmo Zumwalt, asked me to become part of his team as his special assistant and to reconstruct the military from an elitist conscription organization of the Vietnam era and to make it into a racially and gender-blind meritocracy. And one of my jobs, in addition to that, was to be the person who wrote all the speeches and congressional testimony and op-ed pieces. And
I see. But that was, I'm presuming now, as a civilian.
I was a civilian, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they wanted me to become an officer, but this was the height of the Vietnam War, and I was against the I was already a vet. I'd been in the Army, and I was against the Vietnam War. And in fact, I turned the job down twice. Then the third time I accepted.
Okay.
Anyway, I was already very interested in what I called distant viewing. I guess I'm one of the founders of remote viewing, but originally I called it distant viewing. The term remote viewing was coined by Ingo Swann, a New York artist and one of the early remote viewers with the SRI program. Anyway, so I had this strong interest, and a lot of people knew it. And in the late 70, friends in the CIA began to send me material about a man named Leonid Vasiliev, who was a physiologist working in then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. And he asked a question which I had begun to think about, and that was, is this an electromagnetic phenomena? And he had done he was a very good researcher, and he'd done a lot of very meticulous stuff, putting people down into caves and into Faraday cages inside of caves to eliminate electromagnetic radiation. And he had very systematically eliminated the EM spectrum until he got down to ELF, extreme low frequency, 300 to 300 hertz. And he said that's the only part of the EM spectrum that's left, but the only way to test that would be to put somebody in a submarine. And he went to Admiral Gorshkov, the father of the Soviet Blue Water Navy, and Gorshkov wasn't interested. And so I read this. And at the same time, I had begun thinking about the fact that when you ask remote viewers to view tasks, it's difficult for them to provide analytical things like numbers and names because it's very cognitive, whereas most of the remote viewing is sense impressions, taste, touch, smell, and a sense of knowingness about something.
Yes.
And so I thought, well, if you wanted to get that kind of analytical information, how could you do that? And I was preparing a speech for Admiral Zumwalt and was searching through historical material, and I came across a picture and an account of the Battle of Abu Qir Bay in Egypt, in which Admiral Nelson defeated Admiral Bruet, Napoleon's admiral, and thus ended France as a real international sea power. And when Nelson was doing it, he realized that the line of battle would be so long, and with these black powder cannons that shooting at each other, smoke arose and you couldn't see anything. And so how could he communicate with the ships at the other end of the line? And the answer was that he created an associated value. And he created a flag code so that, and I could see a picture of the book, in which a certain flag meant a certain order. And we do this to the day. Nuclear submarines, you saw this in the Quest for Red October movie, where they get a message that's just a little string of numbers, but then you open the book up and it says 1, 2, 3 means target Brooklyn or something, whatever. So I had these two things in my mind, and I thought, well, that would be a way to do it. I could put somebody in a submarine, and I could also do this, what I then called associated remote viewing, or associational remote viewing. And as it happened, I was flying up to Groton, Connecticut to launch a submarine, and I flew up on John Warner, who was then Secretary of the Navy's plane, and on the plane also was Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the nuclear navy, and you couldn't serve on a nuclear submarine or a nuclear ship at all without his personal okay. I mean, absolutely unprecedented in the Navy, before or since. Anyway, and I asked Rickover if I could go aboard one of the boomers, these big missile submarines that go down for months at a time, and run this series of experiments that I want to do, the associational one, to test this hypothesis that Vasiliev had brought up. Is this an EM phenomena? And he said, well, let me get back to you. And he called me about a week later, and he said, you know, it's a really interesting experiment, but if I were to do it, Senator Proxmire, who was then a senator from Wisconsin.
Yes, my state.
Yes, who was giving out what he called the Golden Fleece Award for misuse of government funding. He'll hear about it, and it'll cause a lot of hoo-ha in the media, and I just don't need that, so I'm sorry, Stephen, but I'm not going to do it.
Parenthetically, I might mention, as being from Wisconsin, I wrote to Proxmire on behalf of Puthoff and Targ years later at SRI, and talked about my interest in parapsychology and asked him, are you going to award the Golden Fleece Award for this work? And
I never heard that.
Yes, he wrote me back a letter. It is in the archives now from the remote viewing research, in which he praised that work.
Ah, well, there you go.
And wished me a lot of success in my career in parapsychology.
I had never heard that story. Well, in any case, Rickover was afraid of getting the Golden Fleece Award.
Yeah, many people were intimidated.
I mean, this is 1970. I discovered the Abu Qir Bay thing in the Associated. That's 71. Yeah. So this is about a year later, 72. And anyway, he wouldn't do it. So it looked like it was never going to happen. Yeah. Now, also, this is important, at the same time, the Navy had decided that ELF, because it does penetrate to a certain depth in seawater, was the way they were going to communicate with the boomers.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want them to come too high to the surface, because then Soviet satellites going over would get the heat bloom from the reactors. So they wanted to keep and other things. They wanted to keep the submarines submerged so that they couldn't be located.
Yeah.
And the way to do this would be ELF. So they had started a project that was originally called Project ELF, and then became Project Sanguine. or maybe that's the other way around. Anyway, they had started a very comprehensive study of ELF penetration, which was the one thing that Vasiliev didn't know. How deep do you have to go to get past the, right?
Yeah.
So,
I know there have been many, many rumors about, was this some sort of secret mind control with these huge transmitters?
Yes.
So on.
No, it was to communicate with the boomers.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it just looked like it was never going to happen because you can't get a submarine easily.
Yeah.
And then I was offered the senior fellowship at Philosophical Research Society, which you were involved with. And I went out and I stayed with Don Keach, who was the man who found the hydrogen bomb off Palermo. And his best friend is a man named Don Walsh, who was the guy who made in Trieste with Auguste Piccard, made the deepest dive in history to the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench. And they had retired from they were friends. They had retired from the Navy. I had left the Navy now. I had just written Secret Vaults, hadn't been published yet. And when I stayed with Don Keach, I was explaining to him, this issue. And he said, well, we have a submarine that's coming down from Canada, from the Heiko Corporation to do her sea trials at our facility. They had taken over the Institute of Marine and Coastal Studies of the University of Southern California, and they had a big facility out on Santa Catalina Island. And he said, we have this submarine that's coming down for 3 days, and we're coming down for the summer, and we'll give you 3 days. We're interested. Don and I are Don. We're interested in your experiment. We remembered that from when we were all involved with the Navy. We'd like to see what happens. So we'll underwrite the cost of 3 days of the submarine, which was a huge deal.
Yeah.
And thus became Project Deep Quest. And Deep Quest had several functions. First, the question was, could remote viewers on the shore, on land, locate a previously unknown wreck on the sea floor? That is, could they penetrate through hundreds of feet of seawater to locate an unknown wreck on the sea floor? Not only locate it, but to describe it. It's in detail, what would be found there, how it got there, the whole history of the thing. A. B. To test this idea I had of associated remote viewing. And C. To see whether electromagnetic radiation could explain what was going on. The Navy had also, in the ELF sanguine process, they had worked out exactly what the bit rate of transmission was. And so, for instance, it takes 60 bits, as an example, to transmit a simple geometric form like a rectangle. Just you draw a rectangle, well, that takes about 60 bits of information.
Okay.
And so they knew exactly how much information you could get through with ELF.
Yeah.
And I knew from the remote viewing research I'd done that a typical remote viewing involved thousands of bits of information, far greater than could possibly be transmitted, even with ELF. If ELF was the explanation, you couldn't do it because there's just too much data. So that was what Deep Quest was about.
Now, I might mention once again, parenthetically, that the idea that this might be related to electromagnetic radiation was first just written about, I suppose, by Upton Sinclair in his book Mental Radio.
Yes, Upton Sinclair, and then in 1973, I think I have that right, a researcher at Laurentia University, Michael Persinger, who had gotten very interested in the effects of electromagnetic and geomagnetic fields on performance and effects on consciousness, had published a paper in which he argued that if there was an EM explanation for these non-local consciousness phenomena, it had to be ELF. And he advanced this argument. And but the only way to test it again was you had to get a submarine. So I created Project Deep Quest. Literally a few days before we did it, I had just met Ed May at SRI.
Mm-hmm. A physicist who's been a guest on this program many times.
Yes, and I knew Ingo. I had met Ingo through another set of people, and through Ingo I had literally just met Hella Hamid, and so I sent out to 11 people a map of the harbor, not the harbor, a sea chart of the sea around Catalina Island.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked the remote viewers, the 11 remote viewers, if they would locate a previously unknown wreck on the seafloor and describe it for me in detail and what would be found there and all of that.
Because these remote viewers were already working with Puthoff and Targ at SRI?
No. None of these people. I didn't know anybody from SRI.
Oh. You mentioned, didn't you mention?
I met Ingo.
You met Ingo.
I had met Ingo, so I knew him socially a little bit.
Yeah.
And through him, I met Ed May. A few weeks before we did Deep Quest.
Okay.
The Deep Quest planning. I mean, these projects all take a lot of time.
Yeah.
Had been going on for about 6 months.
I see.
And originally, Alan Vaughn.
Yes.
Who you know.
Good friend of mine.
Yes.
The late Alan Vaughn.
Late Alan Vaughn and George McMullen, the late George McMullen. They were originally going to be the people that were going to take part in the field work.
Okay.
And so.
And then Ed May brought in others.
No.
Okay. No. I don't want to jump the gun.
Yeah. No, what happened was Alan got a very bad flu. And George, who was the manager of a Chrysler dealership parts department, a coworker had a wife who was pregnant, and he took leave so that he would be at home after she had her baby, and that meant that George couldn't come. And so at the very last minute, the two people that I had asked to come out and do the ARV part, the Associated Remote Viewing, and to do the field work. The archaeological work is done pre-field work and then field work, and then the evaluation is done post-field work by experts in this field. So suddenly I had these two openings, and Ed said, well, you know, I could do this and this part, and he introduced me to Hella. And also to, I wanted an independent, all of my experiments have an independent observer who keeps track of everything and who observes and who's not involved in it. And he suggested a woman named Ann Cale, who was at the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. And the Institute of Marine and Coastal Studies proposed a man named Brad Veek, who was the deputy director of the Institute and a career submariner. To be my independent observers, so that, and we film everything, so that there's no question about what's going on, and we develop the remote viewing hypotheses for the archaeological part, and then that's all notarized and turned over to a third party, so you have an unimpeachable chronology. Anyway,
so
all of that.
The main remote viewer then was Hella Hamid.
No, the two. When we actually did the field work out in the submarine, the two viewers were Ingo Swan and Hella Hamid.
Okay.
And Hella, I literally met the day we did the experiment. I had sent her the map, talked to her on the phone, sent her the map. She sent me back the response to the map. Brad Veek took all of the maps, put them on a light table, correlated them, found the consensus zone, and actually found a couple of consensus zones.
So in other words, before the submarine was ever launched for your project, you had already identified areas to look at.
A particular area, yes. We had identified a ship which the viewers said had gone down about 90 years ago, that it had gone down because it had an early steam winch. The winch, high-pressure winch, had caught fire had set the ship on fire, and that the ship had sunk in place. And then Hella Hamid had said, a number of viewers had said, you're going to find this winch, You're going to find the aft helm of the ship. You're going to find a bunch of other things about the ship. And then at the last minute, Hella said, you're going to find this large granite block that's about 5 or 6 feet long and about 4 feet wide and about 4 feet high. And drew it. And of course, all of that is turned over to the independent observers. They notarize everything. It's all sealed, and the purpose is to establish an unimpeachable chronology.
Yes.
So the predictions occurred before the field work, so that nobody can say, "Oh well, you made that up to conform with whatever."
Yeah, after the fact.
After
Post
the fact.
hoc.
Yeah, post hoc. So we went out, and we found the ship. They dropped a buoy from the surface ship down to exactly the center of the location the remote viewers had picked, so that we could only go to that one place. And we were homing in on it because they dropped this little pinger. And with Ingo aboard the submarine, and Ingo said, "Go there, go there," and we went, and there it was.
Fine-tune the exact location.
And this is all filmed, by the way. It was all filmed as it happened. All of my experiments, I filmed them so that there's just no question about what's going on. Anyway, we found the ship, and then to test the EM hypothesis and the associated remote viewing hypothesis, we took first Hella and submerged, and her task was to describe where Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ from the SRI lab were hiding, somewhere in Northern California. She didn't know. It's double blind. And the ship location is triple blind.
So at this point, it's fair to say Hella had been working with Russell and Hal at SRI.
Oh, yes. Hella was brought in, as Russell says, as to be a control.
Right.
And it turned out not only was she good at it, she was great at it.
Yeah.
And she worked with me for 15 years, long after. She left when Russell left SRI, she left, and she worked with Mobius until she died.
Which was the organization you were running at
My
the
lab.
time.
I started, there were 3 labs that really created remote viewing. The SRI lab, the Mobius lab, and the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research lab. And those 3 labs, there are other people that did things. So I don't want to mischaracterize, but there are 3 basic labs that really focused on remote viewing beginning in the early 70s, or in my case, in the late 60s. In any case, we found the ship, and Hella and then Ingo separately were able to describe, they went to different places, Hal and Russ, were accurately able to describe them. And that demonstrated that it was not EM, but also demonstrated, because there was an associational value, that it meant that they had a message. My original message that was going to go with Alan Vaughn and George was a particular restaurant I would take all the viewers to. Anyway, so we did the Deep Quest experiment, which was completely successful. And you know, when you're doing something like this, and you're doing it, and people are witnessing it, and you're filming it, I mean, the chance of being grossly embarrassing is quite high.
Yeah.
So I was very happy. Everything worked. And I was terribly excited about it. And I about a week later, Linda Evans gave a dinner party.
The actress.
The actress. And I went to the dinner party, and sitting across from me was, I think he was a dentist, a physician or a dentist, I can't remember. And they asked me to explain what I was doing, and someone at the table said, "Well, you know, what do you think about that?" And he said, "I think it's all BS. I don't believe any of this." And I looked at him and said, "Well, what would make you believe it?" He said, "Well, if you could win a horse race, I'd believe that, because everybody knows horse races are random." So I thought, okay. So I called up Ed, and Hella was then up in Palo Alto, and Ingo was down with me, and I asked, not Ingo. I wanted to have one experienced viewer, Hella, and one utterly naive viewer, and I asked the woman cinematographer who had filmed Deep Quest in the field, a woman named Nettie Pena, who'd never even heard of remote viewing, let alone done one, if she would like to be the other viewer.
Because you like working with multiple viewers.
I've always worked with multiple viewers. For the same reason that police interview multiple witnesses, or the intelligence community uses multiple sources, both human intelligence and electronic intelligence. Yes, of course. Anyway, they were successfully able to pick the winner of the 6th race, horse number 6, at Hollywood Park Trotter, a trotter's race. And so we went out to the race. They came down, Hella came down, and I can't remember whether Ed did, but Hella came down, and we all went out to Hollywood Park, and we bet $2 on horse number 6 in the 6th race, and by God, it won. We won $14. And we're leaping up and down, and my little 8-year-old daughter had come with us and said, "Daddy, if I was doing that, you'd complain." I mean, we're just going, screaming and yelling.
No, you mentioned your daughter was quite talented, as I recall.
Yeah, oh, well.
But one other thing about Project Deep Quest worth mentioning is that in this area, as I recall, in the ocean around Santa Catalina Island, there were maybe 90 known wrecks.
Right.
Your remote viewers were able to locate and pinpoint accuracy an unknown wreck in the midst of all of that.
Well, so then we had all the data. So then we, as I always do, I want everything to be evaluated by independent experts because I don't believe in omni-scientists. So I went to the Bureau of Land Management and to their Marine Sites Board, and I asked them, they keep track of all the wrecks on the coastline of the United States. Do you have such a wreck? And they said on camera and in a report, we have no knowledge of any such wreck. We have never heard of this wreck or of a ship of this type, even. And, of course, we found Hella's block.
Oh, yeah, the big granite block.
One of the things that taught me is that remote viewers develop specialty skills. And Hella's specialty skill, she was a fine arts photographer. She had a very good eye, was she always described the low a priori thing that was present at the site, in this case the block, something you'd never expect to be there. So anyway, we did that. We went to the University of Southern California, and we went to the marine biology people, and they measured we brought up samples, and they measured the thickness of the incrustation of marine growth, which grows at a very fixed rate. And they said this ship went down 90 years ago, which was what the remote viewer said. We found the winch. We found charred pieces of wood. We had specialists in nautical construction who looked at the winch and said, oh, yeah, this is one of these high-pressure winches, and they quit using them because they had a tendency to blow up and set fire to the ship. And we found charred pieces of wood, so that's how the ship sank. It turned out it was a kind of coaster ship that was bringing blocks of granite up to San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake in order to build the pediments and the stairs that you see in the row houses in San Francisco.
I see.
And they were bringing this, that was what that big block was. So we were gradually able, with the help of archaeologists and marine biologists and metallurgists and the Marine Sites Board, to go back and sort of reverse engineer exactly what this ship was, why it was there, how it had sunk, when it had sunk, and it all agreed with the previously notarized and sealed descriptions provided by the remote viewers.
What an excellent example of an interdisciplinary research project incorporating parapsychology as one important element.
Yes, remote viewing is a tool. It's not the end product. It's like sonar or ground-penetrating radar. I mean, that's the way I think of it. And yes, this set the pattern for all of my experiments. It was interdisciplinary. It was working with very widely recognized and respected experts, each operating in his or her own specialty area, and it demonstrated very clearly under triple-blind conditions that you could use remote viewing to find archaeological sites and also to communicate.
Stephen Schwartz, thank you so much for sharing this important research with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.